The Newcastle Mounted Rifles were one of the many volunteer units established in Natal in order to provide some form of local military presence and protection, with British Imperial troops being forever spread thin across the vast empire. Newcastle was established in 1864 and was the most northerly city in Natal, lying some 40 kilometres north of Dundee. It would not be until October of 1875 that the Newcastle Mounted Rifles would be raised, making it one of the more recent additions to Natal's forces, and still a relatively young unit by the start of the Anglo-Zulu War in January 1879. The unit was seemingly well received, and would turn out 46 members by the end of the first year, under the command of a local magistrate, Melmoth Osborne, him being elected captain by the men. The uniform of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles consisted of a dark green tunic with a black collar edged in black. The tunic had black V-shaped cuff facings edged in black with a trifold knot. 5 rows of black braid were present across the front, similar in style to the British officer's blue patrol jacket. Black shoulder boards completed the tunic. The trousers were dark green, with a black stripe running down the length of the seam. Boots were black, and equipment consisted of a brown leather bandolier and a white haversack. Each trooper also had a white pith helmet, similar in style to the British Foreign Service helmet. The helmet lacked the spike often seen with other Natal mounted volunteer units, and it is unclear to me whether this helmet would be commonly stained on campaign or not, as was often seen in British infantry. For the invasion of Zululand, Lord Chelmsford lacked any Imperial cavalry, so vital for military operations, and was forced to use what was locally available. One obvious source was the local Natal volunteer units, specifically those who were mounted. After a great deal of negotiating with Sir Henry Bulwer, the then Lieutenant Governor of the colony of Natal, Lord Chelmsford pressured him into consenting to the use of Natal's forces in Zululand. The majority of these forces were sons of gentry, and on the whole were very enthusiastic about volunteering for active service. They volunteered for a variety of reasons: to escape the boredom of day-to-day life, to see some action, a sense of duty, or a genuine feeling of duty to remove the perceived threat of the Zulu kingdom. The Newcastle Mounted Rifles reported for duty numbering 30 men, led by a prominent member of Newcastle society, Captain Robert Bradstreet. Second in command was Lieutenant Charles Jones, whose brother Reuben was a trooper with the unit, and whose other brother Sam had also tried to enlist, but was turned down due to his youth. He instead found work as a wagon driver for the army. The Newcastle Mounted Rifles would form part of No. 3 column under the nominal command of Colonel Glynn of the 24th, but under practical command of Lord Chelmsford himself, having attached himself and his staff to the column. The volunteer corps had gathered at Helpmacar in preparation for the invasion. Although they expected to be under the command of the popular Major John Dardanel, formerly of the 88th, they instead found themselves under the command of Brevet Lieutenant Colonel John Cecil Russell, a special service officer from the 12th Lancers. The volunteer corps as a whole took this revelation badly. It can be assumed the Newcastle Mounted Rifles were no different in this regard. In response to this reaction, Major Dardanel was instead given a place on Lord Chelmsford's staff. When No. 3 column advanced into Zululand at the start of the invasion on the 11th of January, the Newcastle Mounted Rifles were tasked with performing the usual cavalry duties of reconnaissance for the main force, this apparently being approached in a very relaxed manner. The 16th of January would see the unit's first casualty, this also being the first white casualty of No. 3 column. This occurred when the Newcastle Mounted Rifles had gone down to bathe in a nearby river, and Trooper Arthur Dixon was dragged into a hole by the current and, being unable to swim, drowned. Despite a search by his comrades, his body was never found. On the 20th of January, Lord Chelmsford decided to send out a force to thoroughly scout the Malakatha mountain range in order to locate any potential Zulu force. The Natal Volunteers and the NNC would provide the manpower for this sweep, and they would be led by Major Dardanel. Leaving early on the 21st, the Newcastle Mounted Rifles would be a part of the sweep, though 17 of their number would stay behind at the camp then being established by No. 3 column at Isandlwana, in order to provide mounted pickets. Detachments from other volunteer units would also be left behind for similar purposes. These would be under the command of Captain Bradstreet. The mounted men under Dardanel soon moved ahead of the NNC, and the Newcastle Mounted Rifles found themselves patrolling the mountains and heights on the 21st, moving through steep and rocky terrain that was severe enough to require the men to dismount in places. The weather was hot, reaching over 40 degrees, and the Newcastle Mounted Rifles searched the vast landscape dotted with Zulu homesteads and mealie fields for any sign of the Zulu army. By mid-afternoon, a party from Dardanel's force reported seeing a large group of Zulus, around 700 in number, and the patrol became hopeful at the prospect of locating the Zulus' main army. Therefore, despite the original plan to return to camp that evening, they decided to remain in place so as not to break contact with the Zulus, instead sending word back to Lord Chelmsford of their discovery. The men of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles would spend an uncomfortable night in the hills with the rest of Dardanel's force, with multiple sightings of large bodies of Zulus in the area. Acting on the information from Dardanel's patrol, Lord Chelmsford decided to take a large portion of his force, consisting of Colonel Glynn and his staff, 6 companies of the 2nd 24th, 4 guns of N5 Battery Royal Artillery, and most of the mounted infantry. Their objective was to engage and destroy the Zulu army, expecting a lot of skirmishing and guerrilla fighting as was experienced in the 9th Cape Frontier War the previous year. The force left at the camp at Isandlwana consisted of 5 companies of the 1st 24th, 2 guns of N5 Battery, as well as detachments from the Natal Volunteers and the NNC. The camp also contained a great deal of the staff and logistical personnel required by the column and was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Pillane. They would soon be joined by Colonel Anthony Durnford. In the camp, Captain Bradstreet found himself in command of around 30 mounted infantrymen and around 100 Natal volunteers, including those of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles. As is well known, the Zulu army, under the command of Nichingleo Kamahola, outmaneuvered Lord Chelmsford and would attack Pillane and Durnford in the Great Battle of Isandlwana. As the fighting got underway that day, and the British formed their firing line, Captain Bradstreet's command found themselves ordered to take up position, lined up at the bottom of an escarpment, before being sent forwards to cover the initial retreat of the British firing line along the ridge. As the battle progressed, Durnford's men took up position in a donga, while the rest of the force formed a long curved line, with Bradstreet's men between the 3 NNMC under Raw, Vos, and Roberts, and the companies of the 24th under Moyston and Cavey. They formed part of this firing line, dismounted, and attempting to halt the Zulu advance. As the Zulu left horn started to come into sight, a request was made to Pillane to take Bradstreet's men on a charge to counter the threat. Though as the men were part-time volunteers and not regular cavalry, this action was decided against. Instead, they mounted and advanced at a canter across the open ground to a drift by the Ngoni. Here they dismounted and formed a line along the bank of a watercourse with ankle-deep water at the bottom. Ahead of Bradstreet's new position was Durnford's command, steadily retreating in the face of several thousand Zulu warriors. Soon, Durnford and Bradstreet's men were holding the Ngoni position with steady carbine fire against the Zulu left horn for around half an hour. The men of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles taking careful shots at the determined Zulu assault in the monumental task of holding back the left horn. Soon a large force of Zulus made an attempt to exploit the gap between Durnford and Bradstreet's men in the stream and the rest of the British line. With the Zulus closing in and ammunition running critically short, Durnford ordered his command, including Bradstreet and his men, to fall back to the camp. Soon the camp itself would be overrun, and many of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles with it. Captain Bradstreet was last said to be seen fighting with sword and revolver in hand. Those of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles who could used their mounts to escape amongst the chaos along Fugitive's Drift. News of the defeat spread like wildfire across Natal and caused great unrest and anxiety amongst the settler population. In Newcastle, Maud Bradstreet had just helped her friend Mrs. Hitchcock deliver a baby girl when they heard the news that the Newcastle Mounted Rifles had fought at Isandlwana and both their husbands had been killed in the fighting. It was a survivor from the Newcastle Mounted Rifles, Trooper Burning, who was one of the first to carry the news to Pietermaritzburg. The war would carry on quietly for the remainder of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles until, after seeing a great deal of reinforcement from Britain, Lord Chelmsford reorganised his force in May for a second invasion. The Newcastle Mounted Rifles found themselves included in the new Cavalry Brigade, commanded by General Frederick Marshall. During the invasion, the Natal Volunteers found themselves relegated to guarding supply lines, patrolling lines of communication, and such work. Eventually, the war would end at the Battle of Isandlwana, at which the Newcastle Mounted Rifles did not take part. The Volunteers returned to their lives in Natal, and the most significant and bloody chapter in the history of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles came to an end. They were shortly after disbanded. The casualties of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles at the Great Battle of Isandlwana were as follows: Captain Bradstreet, Quartermaster Hitchcock, Sergeant Swan, Trooper Barnes, Trooper Greenbank, Trooper McAllister, and Trooper Dinkelman. This was an attempt to take a look at a small portion of the British forces during the Anglo-Zulu War, namely the Newcastle Mounted Rifles. Anyone with an interest in learning more about this topic, I would greatly encourage to read some of the multiple books available that cover this period in history, particularly those by Mr. Ian Knight, such as Zulu Rising, which was one of my primary sources for this video and research. Other sources used alongside Zulu Rising by Mr. Ian Knight were Zulu, the Heroism and Tragedy of the Zulu War of 1879 by Mr. Saul David, Zulu War Volunteers, Irregulars and Auxiliaries by Mr. Ian Castle, and the website northeastmedals.com provided the casualty list for the Battle of Isandlwana. Any mistakes during this short presentation are entirely my own, and I hope it was of some interest to somebody out there. Thank you very much for listening. This was the first video of yet another history channel.